Welcome to Chapter 14, the Digestive System. The digestive system's job is, its primary job is to bring nutrients into the body. Now, where do nutrients come from? Of course, nutrients come from the food that we consume. So through the food that we consume, the digestive system's job is to digest that food and break it down into nutrients that the body can use. So let's go through the organs of the digestive system. The mouth. Of course, the mouth is there. The mouth connects to the pharynx. Okay. The mouth and the pharynx. So the mouth's job is to chew the food. There's partial digestion there in the food or in the mouth, and the tongue has a role as well in not only tasting food but also moving food around and helping process the food. Okay, now aside from that, there's accessory organs that I will discuss afterwards. But in this particular case, it's relevant right now. So in the mouth, we have these glands. Okay, so we're going to look closely at the glands. We have something called salivary glands. Okay, we have several under your tongue, under your jaw, on the side of your jaw. And what these salivary glands do is, as soon as food enters the mouth and you start chewing up your food, these glands are going to respond and release saliva to moisten that food. They'll release a chemical called bicarbonate that helps maintain pH, and they release an enzyme called amylase that breaks down starch, and they also release something called lysozyme, which inhibits bacterial activity. So this is one line of defense for the body, bringing in food. Okay, the pharynx is it's an airway and a food passageway. So in the digestive system, of course, it's going to act as a food passageway that connects the mouth to the esophagus. And the esophagus is kind of like a long tube that connects the mouth with the stomach. Okay, the stomach stores and mixes food. As soon as food enters, the stomach is triggered to release chemicals that digest proteins, and there's acids released, and of course the stomach is responsible for regulating the delivery of all of the food that's being churned up here to the next organ in line. Okay, so the stomach stops here, and it's going to enter the small intestine. And the small intestine starts there, but it's covered up. So behind it, it ends up the anatomy of it is it's technically folded and coiled up in this segment of the abdomen. The small intestine has a major role in digestion. 90% of digestion happens in the small intestine, which we will discuss. It also absorbs water. It secretes digestive hormones and enzymes. Okay, and then the small intestine connects to the large intestine. The large intestine is large in diameter but small in length, and its anatomy is as follows. So there's a segment that's ascending, a segment that's transverse, and a segment that's descending, and then eventually connects to the colon, rectum, and anus. Now, the small intestine is involved in digestion. The large intestine absorbs water, and then it's going to store waste and until it's ready to leave. Okay, the colon technically stores feces, and ultimately the rest is an outward passageway for feces. Now let's look at the accessory organs. We have the liver. So this structure right here is the liver, and the liver has several important jobs, but one of the most important jobs, one of the most important, is it makes something called bile. Bile helps to break down fats, and it helps with other things, which we will discuss as well. Okay, right underneath the liver, see this little tiny green thing? Okay, that is the gallbladder. And the gallbladder sits right under the liver, and its job is to assist the liver where it stores and concentrates bile. So that's important. So people that have their gallbladder removed are supposed to reduce their diet, reduce fat in their diet, because they no longer have a concentrated bile accessory organ. Okay, now let's see. The pancreas. So along the stomach, it looks like this is not part of the stomach. It's just laying on top of the stomach. It almost looks like a little leaf. Okay, that is called the pancreas. And the pancreas is an accessory organ that secretes pancreatic enzymes, digestive enzymes, and it delivers them to the small intestine, and there helps digest. Okay, it also releases a chemical called bicarbonate, which helps neutralize food, or technically the partially digested food that's coming from the stomach, which is acidic. The stomach has a pH of 2. Juices from the pancreas help to neutralize that pH. Okay, and here's this little tiny structure right here is your appendix. Okay, going further into anatomy. The walls of the GI tract. All right, so what we just covered is the GI tract. And technically they share these structures in common, which is a 4-layered specialized structure. Now, I'm going to start from the innermost layer. Okay, the innermost layer is called the mucosa. Okay, and notice that it's covered with little tiny microvilli. The second layer is called the submucosa, and notice that it has a nerve. It has vascular tissue in red and blue, and this green is representing lymphatic tissue. Okay, and then the other 2 layers, actually this is conjoined into 1 layer, but it's technically 2. It's called the muscularis, and it's called the muscularis because it's made out of smooth muscle, and remember, muscles contract. So this layer is incredibly important for motility and moving things along the digestive tract because they can contract. Now there's 2 layers. One that has the muscular tissue is in circular layers, and then 1 layer is longitudinal. Okay, so it's just the way that the cells are aligned. That's the difference. And the outermost layer is called the serosa. It's made of connective tissue, and it helps to protect the digestive tract, and it anchors it in place. So none of these organs are moving around. It also has sphincters. A sphincter is something that can contract and uncontract, and it can regulate if something's able to pass or not pass by opening and closing, or contracting and uncontracting. So you want to know those 4 layers. Now let's talk a little bit more about the functions. So there's really 5 basic functions in the digestive system. All right, first, mechanical, processing, and movement. So that's a really simple thing to understand. Mechanical means, this is a physical thing, meaning that the chewing and mixing of food. So we help with that with our jaws and our teeth, but then the mixing is something that happens without our knowledge. So when those muscles contract, for example, they help mix food. Okay, secretion. There's tons of secretion going on. There's fluid that's secreted. There's digestive enzymes and hormones and bile and acid and alkali and mucus and things that are digested into different parts of the digestive system at different times. Of course, there's digestion that occurs. What digestion means is breaking down food to the smallest absorbable unit. Okay, so that's an important element of this whole lecture. Okay, and of course we have both chemical and mechanical breakdown. Okay, then absorption. So once these food particles are broken down to absorbable units, then they're absorbed into the body. They're taken out of the GI tract through the mucosa, and they can move into the blood and lymphatic vessels. And then in the end, of course, elimination. All of the waste material and undigested material, like fibers, have to be eliminated from the system. All right, so when we talk about motility, there's 2 major types of motility in action. Okay, peristalsis and segmentation. All right, so we know that there's a muscular layer in all of the digestive tissue. So what we're looking at here is the esophagus. Remember, the esophagus connects to the stomach. And this is food. Technically, it's a food bolus. And it's already moved down from the mouth to this length. And it's only going to move by being propelled forward via peristalsis. So that's the contraction of the muscles there. And so in the next picture you see that the food bolus has moved further down, and eventually it's moved completely into the stomach. Okay, that's one method of motility. Segmentation. So segmentation is different because it's not moving downwards, it's mixing food together. So the contraction's happening on multiple ends, and there's more than one there's more than one bolus of food, and eventually these will contract and contract and contract and contract until the food is mixed together, and it will continue to do so until they're completely mixed. So the mouth, of course, has a huge role in processing food. It's the very first to begin the process. And our teeth, of course, have a role. Our teeth are designed to bite and chew food, which begins the mechanical breakdown of food. Humans begin with 20 baby teeth that get replaced by 32 adult teeth. And ultimately, I don't really typically go through the anatomy, but I will quickly go through the anatomy. Obviously, this is a molar, so there's a crown. Okay, there's a layer of enamel underneath. This layer is called dentine. And underneath here, this is full of vascular tissue. And not only is it vascular tissue, there's nerves. So this is why going to the dentist is so painful, because the nerves are right there. Okay, and then there is technically a ligament that wraps around called the periodontal ligament. And then, of course, the root. Now, the most important, one of the most important things about teeth is we know that if you eat too much sugar, you will get cavities if you don't take care of your teeth. And it's because bacteria lives on our teeth. And this is a picture under a microscope at approximately 8,000 total magnification, and we can see these little tiny bacteria, and what they actually do is they metabolize sugar so quickly, and that is the actual bacteria, that it breaks down sugar so fast that it starts to cause decay, which is the cavities. So make sure to brush your teeth. All right. The mouth processes food for swallowing, and that's easy to understand. Really quick, let me just review. Your front teeth are called incisors. Your mouth, on the top of your mouth, you have a hard palate and a soft palate. And let me actually add that in right here. So the part that has ridges, if you put your tongue up near your front teeth in your mouth, you're going to find a hard palate. If you move your tongue back towards the back of your mouth, you see that it actually becomes soft, which is called the soft palate. Okay. Okay. Now, way in the back, this little funny structure that hangs down is called the uvula. And on either side are your tonsils, unless, of course, you've had your tonsils removed, and then the tongue. Now, the tongue is a muscle. It's a skeletal muscle, and its job is to help mix and move food around. And, of course, we have our taste buds. So it's to position food in the correct area and to taste. So I'm going to quickly review the taste buds. So there are 4 types of lingual taste buds, or lingual papillae, which papillae are these little, see these little bumps all over your tongue? Those are called papilla. All right, there's 4. And ultimately, I don't test on them, so I don't really go into them too much. We will talk more about taste buds in the sensory chapter, but it's important to understand that there's different types. Of course, here's the body of the tongue, and if we zoom in on, notice if we zoom out on different segments, you're going to find different this is actually completely different papilla. Okay. And all of them are associated with taste buds except for the filiform papilla. Okay, which is this one. Okay, so see, if you look at the anatomy, this is little tiny, that's the papilla. Inside is the taste bud. Papilla, taste bud, papilla, taste bud. Now we'll get more into the actual ability to taste food in the sensory chapter, but it has been said and is widely accepted that the back of your tongue is to taste bitter food, the sides, the upper quadrants are for sour, the lower quadrants salty, and the very, very tip is for sweet. Okay, the mouth processes food for swallowing, and it sure does. So you have what are called salivary glands. We have a parotid salivary gland, which is technically on the side of your jaw, under all the muscles, of course. You have the sublingual gland, which is under the tongue, and the submandibular gland, which is under the jaw. Okay, so these glands are incredibly smart. As soon as food enters the mouth, these glands are going to release. They're going to release enzymes, particularly an enzyme called salivary amylase. Salivary amylase breaks down carbohydrates. It's going to release some mucus to soften the food, and lysozyme, which is antibacterial, antimicrobial. Okay, now, so ultimately what we can say here is the first thing that begins getting digested is carbohydrates. Carbs begin digestion in the mouth, and so technically other things don't get digested in the mouth, such as proteins and fats, right? Just carbs. Now, the pharynx and esophagus deliver food from the stomach to the mouth. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, food comes from the mouth, right? And then it's going to move, when you swallow, basically, it's going to move into the pharynx. Okay, now we have this little structure here called the epiglottis. The epiglottis will close. It's going to completely close. It's like a little flap. It can open and close. In this case, when you're eating, it closes so that it can block off your larynx, which is an airway. And so food continues on the correct path, which would be down the esophagus. Okay, what would be the incorrect path is if it went into the larynx and trachea. This is how you choke. Okay, so we all have a structure called the epiglottis, and when we're eating, it closes shut, and food will move from the mouth past the pharynx to the esophagus. Now, what's important with the esophagus is it really just acts as a pathway, and it does contract, and it contracts and through peristaltic contraction, and it will move food to the stomach, but there is no digestion in the esophagus at all. None at all. It's just a pathway. Okay, so when swallowing, let's look at the swallowing. There's two parts of swallowing. We have the voluntary phase, which you have control over, and the involuntary reflex. So as you chew food, and the tongue will push the food into the pharynx. And actually, once the food has been chewed and mixed in with enzymes and mucus and that sort of thing, it actually has a new name. It's called a bolus of food. Okay, so it's not really food anymore, it's something else. Now it'll move into the pharynx, which is technically your throat. Okay, and then so that's obviously over here. So that gets moved over. And then there is a involuntary swallowing reflex, which is when basically the epiglottis closes. Okay, there's the epiglottis being closed. This is the epiglottis open, closed. Okay, very good. Now, that's important because, again, if your epiglottis spasms in any way and anything passes through, that's when you choke. All right. Now, the epiglottis closes off the larynx and specifically the trachea, which leads to the lungs, and allows food to move down the esophagus. Okay, so there's a voluntary phase that we control and an involuntary phase. Now this is interesting. Now, the esophagus connects to the stomach, and notice that there's two sides to the stomach. There's one side here and one side over here. And what's actually over here is a sphincter. Well, there's one sphincter on this side, another sphincter on the other side. So food's coming through, that sphincter needs to open and then close. And of course, there's an entire process that we'll discuss in the stomach. But here, this is what causes heartburn. Okay, heartburn is, of course, our stomach. I've mentioned this, in the past, but our stomach has a pH of 2. Okay, pH 2 is very, very, very acidic. It's incredibly acidic, in fact. Okay, if something is pH 2, and that means that this is acidic and there's acids in here. So what causes heartburn is if the sphincter spasms even a little bit, and a little bit of acid from the stomach leaks or pretty much basically the sphincter contracts and acid is supposed to stay in the stomach. Sometimes there's a spasm and acid will splash into the esophagus. Thus, we have heartburn. Now, heartburn is not fun. Probably most people have experienced it. But what's interesting is that this little tiny glitch causes this, terrible discomfort. And it has turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry. So the company Nexium, okay, they're an anti-acid company. They bring in $5 billion annually making these anti-acid or this heartburn medication. So it's these little tiny glitches that occur or things that occur in the human body that are not perfect. This is where the pharmaceutical companies come in and try to resolve those issues, bringing in billions. Okay, so the stomach. The stomach is an interesting organ because we don't have anything else that has a pH of 2. Okay, it has 2 sphincters. Okay, so this first one that connects to the esophagus is referred to as the cardiac sphincter. And then this one that connects, notice that the stomach is almost like a bag that's clipped off on 2 sides, clipped here, clipped here. This side connects to the esophagus. This side connects to the small intestine. And the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum, which I will discuss. Now, these sphincters, have to be perfect, and if they're not, then we have some issues like heartburn, and others. Okay, now what happens in the stomach? So food comes from the esophagus. The only thing that's been digested is carbohydrates. Now let's look at the layers of the stomach. So we have our mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis layer, and then the outer layer, right? And so inside, this whole inside layer is very protective. So with the acids that are going to be delivered into the stomach, not only does the anatomy protect it, but of course there's layers of mucus that are going to be released into the stomach to prevent this pH2 from burning a hole through the stomach, right? Okay, so part of its job is to store food, okay, and it digests proteins. And then it's going to deliver partially digested food into the small intestine. Okay, now this whole body of the stomach is capable of contraction. The whole thing can contract and churn food. So remember, proteins are digested here. Now, we have something called gastric juices. The term gastric refers to stomach. That's important to remember. Gastric juices are released so when there's food in the stomach. So our body's smart. It doesn't just release gastric juices all day long. That would be a waste of energy and could be potentially harmful. So basically, when you eat something and it gets to your stomach, the stomach has sensory organs that can detect that, and it will detect it and release the juices, which is a combination of hydrochloric acid. Now remember, HCl, hydrochloric acid, is very acidic. It is the most acidic, one of the most acidic acids on the planet. So it creates a pH 2 in the stomach, which helps break down large pieces of food. Okay, and because of the low pH, it kills bacteria and microbes, which is incredibly important because this is another line of defense. Okay, it also releases something called the intrinsic factor, and basically it's needed to absorb vitamin B12. So some vitamins are absorbed here. Mucus is released to protect the stomach lining from all that acid, and an enzyme called pepsin begins the breakdown of proteins. And if you look at the anatomy of the mucus layer, okay, so here's, or sorry, not the mucus layer, a gastric gland. This is the mucus layer. And notice these structures. This is called a villi. Okay, and basically that whole mucosal layer is one villi after the other, increasing the ability to the surface area and increasing the effectiveness of releasing mucus, okay, releasing acids, releasing pepsin, because they're all right there. All right, now I briefly talked about the layers, but I'll talk about them again. Now the stomach has the same layers that were just zoomed in as what we saw earlier. So it has the mucosa layer, the submucosa layer, muscularis, serosa. Okay, now the stomach is capable of contracting, which means that it churns and it's capable of mixing the food with the gastric juices, breaking it down into small pieces. Now let's do a quick anatomy recap. Okay, so of course this is the mouth, right? And then the pharynx is not labeled here, but the pharynx is there. This is the esophagus. And the numbers correlate to these numbers. The esophagus, okay, the stomach, right there. Okay, this whole internal, compact, almost square looking structure. It's almost tucked in to and surrounded by the large intestine. Of course, that is the small intestine. And then this big structure that wraps around the small intestine, of course, is the large intestine. It's not necessarily labeled here. And then this little tiny piece right here hanging off the large intestine is the appendix. And of course, that is the same appendix that if can rupture. And now you can see why it's so dangerous if the appendix ruptures, because there is waste in this area, and if waste accumulates in the appendix and it ruptures, it can actually kill somebody. If it's not they can go into septic shock if it's not basically if they don't go to an emergency room and have emergency surgery immediately. So that's a big issue. All right, now when the stomach contracts, it moves food forward, and it is capable of contraction within the body of the stomach, and then it will push food out of the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. Now, this is not really food anymore because it is a mixture of water, partially digested food, gastric juices. It is called chyme. So chyme is moving into the small intestine. Okay, so the stomach connects right to the small intestine, and basically what's coming out of here is going to be pretty acidic, and we cannot allow any acidity to enter the small intestine. It can be damaging. So part of what's going to happen is the acidity will be neutralized, and then enzymes and bile will be added to the small intestine to help break down foods, carbohydrates, protein, and bile breaks down fats, which are technically lipids, and they turn it into absorbable material. Okay, 90% of the food is absorbed in the small intestine. So digestion is broken down, or digestion occurs in the small intestine, and then food is absorbed from the small intestine into our blood. The small intestine has 3 regions. Okay, so here's the stomach. The first segment, this area right here, this little kind of fat area, is called the duodenum. Okay, and then if we follow this, the small intestine is actually quite large. Okay, so the middle segment is called the jejunum, and the last segment before it connects to the large intestine, which is here, is called the ileum. The duodenum is where digestion occurs. Most of the digestion in the body occurs here. The jejunum and ileum will absorb the nutrients. So because the small intestine has a large surface area because of the mucosa layer, now if you look at the mucosa layer, each one of these finger-like projections That is called a villi. There it is right here. There's a villi. And if you look closely, every single cell that lines one villi is made up of a cell that carries microvilli. This gives the small intestine an incredibly large surface area for absorption. So we have villi, which are the big finger-like protrusion, and the microvilli, which are on each and every cell that make up the actual villi itself. Okay, how are nutrients digested? Now, you can kind of remember back to the enzyme chapter. Remember enzymes? Enzymes are designed to help break things down and build things, but in this case, digestive enzymes are directly involved in breaking food down. All of these are digestive enzymes. Okay, so, oops. All right. Okay, that's not working the way I want it to. Fine. All right, either way. So this is technically the digestive enzyme. That's what I was trying to point at. Okay, so let's start with carbohydrates. Remember carbohydrates, they are long. Remember these are glucose rings, glucose, glucose, glucose. So carbohydrates are long polysaccharides. All right, so pancreatic amylase will break down carbs like starch into a disaccharide. See this disaccharide? That's two sugars called maltose. Okay, maltose is a disaccharide. That is maltose. A disaccharide. Okay, now, so this carbohydrate is broken down by pancreatic amylase to disaccharides called maltose. Well, remember the thing about enzymes, one of the things is some of them end in ase. Well, maltase is going to take all of the partially digested carbohydrates, such as maltose, and further break them down into glucose. And we need glucose. We need glucose for cellular respiration, and we need a lot of it. And this is where it comes from. It comes from your diet. So I'm going to add that in here. This is for cellular what's wrong with me? Respiration. There we go. Okay, and once glucose is broken down, it is going to be absorbed. It's going to be absorbed into the bloodstream. And this is how your body takes bread, starch, foods, like in that category, carbohydrates, and turns them into glucose and puts them into your bloodstream. Okay, proteins have to go through several stages. Proteins will get broken down into polypeptides. So here's a full protein. Okay, it's going to get broken down by an enzyme called trypsin to a polypeptide. So this is not a full, this isn't what we want. We don't want polypeptides. We want amino acids. And then there's a secondary amino acid, an enzyme called peptidase, which will take the partially digested protein, the polypeptides, and break them down into amino acids. Now we need amino acids. Remember the building blocks of life? Carbs, proteins, lipids. Well, this is it. This is where this comes comes from? Well, of course, there's nucleic acids, but you don't get that from your diet. You get all that stuff from your diet, and your body is strategically designed to pull these important things like glucose and amino acids and take them out of the food, digest them out of the food, and move them into the vascular system. So they will get absorbed into the blood. Okay, and then of course, fats are a little different. So this is bile salt. Bile salt comes from the liver, and fat is pretty globular and it needs to be emulsified. So these bile salts, they interact with the fat, okay, and they help break it down. Now they need more assistance. They'll take this enzyme called lipase, and they will take they will break that. They'll take that whole emulsification droplet and break down the fat globules plus the bile salts into glycerides and fatty acids, which are necessary, and that is absorbed into the lymphatic system. So this is carb digestion, protein digestion, fat digestion, and this occurs in the small intestine, and absorption is happening here. Now let's look at the large intestine. Okay, the function of the large intestine is to absorb salts, vitamins, and water. So if your body needs water returned, if you're a little dehydrated, it's going to get pulled from this area. It temporarily stores waste and then it eliminates waste. Now let's go through the anatomy. So the small intestine, see this open area called the cecum? That is where the small intestine is going to connect. Okay, so after all of that digestion and absorption, what's left over is pretty much waste. There might be a couple more things that need to get pulled out, such as the salts and vitamins, but other than that, it's waste. And then we have it has three segments. It has the ascending colon. This is all the large intestine, the transverse, and descending. Now, ascending means upwards. Transverse means side to side. Something that's descending, think of stairs. Descending means that it's going downwards. Okay, so of course the structure is the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then see how it starts to bend here? This is called the sigmoid colon, and then of course the rectum and anus. Now we talked about accessory organs, and they are just as important as the primary organs. Let's start with the liver. Okay, here's the liver. The liver is quite a big organ. Okay, and notice that the gallbladder is right there. It's attached and under the liver, and it also has a bile duct that connects to the small intestine. This is the duodenum, there's the stomach. Okay, so the liver makes the bile salts, and the gallbladder, okay, it stores the bile and it delivers the bile through the bile duct right here to the small intestine to break down fats. That's the accessory organ, and that's the primary, one of the main jobs in digestion and absorption that these two have. Now here's the pancreas. The pancreas is this leaf-like structure. It's really thin and flat, and it lays partially on the stomach and just kind of wraps around. It's connected through membranous tissue. And the pancreas also has something called a pancreatic duct. Okay, pancreas secretes tons of enzymes. It secretes enzymes that break down fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. It helps to neutralize the acidity by releasing something called sodium bicarbonate, which neutralizes the acidic chyme that's coming out of the stomach and moving into the small intestine. And it's all delivered through the pancreatic ducts to the small intestine. Okay, now we've somewhat discussed this, so this is good for you guys to review. It kind of puts it into black and white terminology, what the pancreas does, what the liver and gallbladder do. Okay, now this is what I wanted to get to. This is called the hepatic portal system. Now here's the thing. You eat food and it's digested properly, and it's broken down into these small absorbable nutrients that we discussed. And just to be completely effective, that is what I showed in the previous picture. Absorbable nutrients, what's glucose, right? We want amino acids, and we would like to have glycerol and fatty acids. That's what we want. And we know that the small intestine is going to absorb those nutrients. Those nutrients, where do they go next? They're absorbed into the blood, but then what? We can't, in fact, just let them circulate through the blood. That's not going to work. So what is going to work is this, the hepatic portal system. Our hepatic portal system is absolutely brilliant. And this is why. So once food is digested and absorbed, or nutrients, sorry. Okay, of course it's going to enter, see all of this vascular tissue. This is part of the hepatic portal system. But all of those nutrients that come from both the small intestine or the large intestine, okay, on both sides is going to enter this hepatic portal vein. And the hepatic portal vein is specifically for detox. Now, we can't just take glucose and amino acid and glycerol and fatty acid into the blood. There's no way. So it will take it to temporarily into the hepatic portal system, and then it moves to the liver. So this is the second job of the liver. Its job is to cleanse and clean and detox every single nutrient. And then only will, after it's been completely detoxed and they're perfect, will the liver release them into the inferior vena cava. And remember, the inferior vena cava goes to the heart. And at that point, it enters the general circulation system. So the hepatic portal system is designed to detox all of the nutrients that are absorbed. So I have an animation for you guys, but I will play it at the end, actually. Okay, so now it's important to understand that we are learning each system individually. That is true. However, all of them intertwine and they are dependent on one another. And there are certain systems such as the nervous system. Remember, I said the nervous system is the boss, and the endocrine system has a huge role in almost everything. Okay, so of course they're going to have a role in digestion. Now, of course, it depends on how much a person is consuming and the content of the food, but we have something called stretch receptors in the stomach. So when you eat and food eventually makes its way to the stomach, it will stretch. And the stretch receptors are genius. They can detect any small change in the stomach, and immediately those receptors are, of course, connected to nerves, which, of course, are connected to the brain. And the brain will respond, the nervous system will respond and increase peristalsis, and it will also initiate the secretion of gastric juices. So therefore, gastric juices and peristalsis doesn't just happen 24 hours a day. It's controlled by the nervous system, and that is very important to understand. The nervous system is a big regulator. Okay, hormones are involved as well, which of course is the endocrine system. And these are the three hormones that are primarily involved: gastrin, secretin, CKK. Gastrin is a hormone that releases the gastric juices, stimulates the release of gastric juices. Secretin, it stimulates the pancreas to secrete water and bicarbonate, which is very helpful. And CKK instructs that pancreas to secrete all of those great digestive enzymes, and it also tells the gallbladder to release bile. We absolutely are completely dependent on the nervous system and the endocrine system to do their job correctly so that we do not get sick. Let's talk about a couple of disorders of the GI tract. Okay, so lactose intolerance. Now, if someone cannot break down milk or digest milk, they're lactose intolerant. And lactose is a disaccharide. People that are lactose intolerant, what's happening with them is they lack the enzyme called lactase that breaks down the sugar in milk, which is known as lactose, making them lactose intolerant and making them feel not so great. Okay, ulcers. Peptic ulcers are caused by an infection from a bacteria called H. pylori bacteria, and ulcers are incredibly painful. Celiac disease. If someone has celiac disease, that means that they're gluten intolerant. So ultimately, unless you have celiac disease, there's really no reason to eat gluten-free unless you have celiac disease. Now, I know there's like a big trend about being gluten-free and this and that, and people, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that is one of the big misconceptions, is that people don't realize that celiac disease is the reason why a person would need to cut gluten, which is wheat, the protein in wheat, and found in barley and rye. And if the body cannot fully digest them, then they get sick. If you do not have celiac disease, it is not necessary for you to pay extra money for gluten-free food. This is kind of just a bandwagon people have jumped on. Okay, diverticulosis is when the walls of the small intestine weaken, and that will back somebody up, which is not good. Okay, and one of the dangerous things, okay, is polyps, colon polyps. People after a certain age should get colonoscopy. They're just growths in the mucosal layer in the colon, but however, there's a point where they could become cancerous. But though, yeah, so after a certain age, your doctor will order a colonoscopy. Okay, in this segment, this is digestion, and I want you guys to take notes on everything that I'm going to be presenting. So go ahead and start here. What's going on here is we're going to talk about digestion of a sandwich, which will suffice for explaining digestion in general. Okay, so everything that I have that I will present, I would like you to draw it on a nice blank sheet of paper and of course study it. And you have the ability and the option to stop the video at any time and write down notes. Okay, so here we go. So this is digestion of food, and the example we're going to use is eating a sandwich, and we know that sandwiches, this particular sandwich is going to have bread, meat, and cheese, and what bread is essentially is carbohydrates. Meat will give us protein in the end, and cheese will give us fats. Now remember, the building blocks of life are carbs, proteins, lipids, which fats fall under lipids, and then nucleic acids, but of course you don't get nucleic acids from your diet. Okay, so in other words, this is how your body takes food and turns food into nutrients. Okay, so digestion begins in the mouth, and it begins when you chew up your sandwich here. Okay, and ultimately your body is incredibly intelligent. We have glands, our salivary glands will release an enzyme called amylase. That's one of the enzymes that is released here. And the salivary amylase, in this case, because it comes from the salivary glands, it's called salivary amylase. Amylase breaks down starch into a disaccharide called maltose. Remember, disaccharides are two sugars. Okay, so that's partial digestion. And ultimately, your glands are also going to release mucus and things like that. And between the chewing that we do with our teeth, and your tongue is going to help with propulsion and moving food forward. Okay, we end up with something called a food bolus. So it now has a new name, food bolus. Okay, so it's not really a sandwich anymore. And food bolus is a mixture of enzymes and mucus, and it's partially digested food. Okay, so where does it go next? Okay, so from the mouth, the food bolus will move via peristalsis to the esophagus. Yes, it's going to pass through the pharynx, and the epiglottis will block the trachea, and that is true. But if we're going to do a straight cut direction of digestion, the food goes from the mouth, okay, and it goes through all of this, and then it's going to go to the esophagus. The esophagus acts as a connection between the mouth and the stomach, and no digestion occurs here. There's no breakdown of food. There's no enzymes. It's just a passage, right? And so that's important to understand. And then once food is propelled down the esophagus, it's going to enter the stomach. And the stomach has a pH of 2. And remember, pH 2 is very, very, very acidic. And that pH 2 is important for our health, because something that acidic is going to kill microbes, bacteria, most of it anyways. I mean, this is different if you eat something that is poisonous or that is rotten, that's a different story. That, that might not be, not everything can be killed by pH 2, but mostly in regular things, yes, this is one of our lines of defense. Okay, so what's happening next? Okay, the stomach. In the stomach, what is going to occur is, of course, there's going to be a release of hydrochloric acid along with enzymes. And one particular enzyme called pepsin breaks down proteins into amino acids, and in the stomach, that is actually the only thing that is broken down is proteins. And at this time, between the acidity from the stomach, the hydrochloric acid, and the breakdown of the proteins, we end up with this partially digested food ball called chyme. Okay, so notice we started here with a food bolus that moved down the esophagus. Then once it got mixed in with the stomach, it has a new name, which is chyme. And it's a partially digested food bolus. And of course, it's pretty acidic, but that's okay because we have a system to balance that acidity. So that partially digested food ball is going to move to the small intestine, which is the next organ in line. And 90% of digestion happens within the small intestine, and in fact it happens within the duodenum, which is the first segment of the small intestine. Okay, so we have accessory organs that are going to assist in digestion. For example, the liver is going to release bile salts that help break down fats. And the pancreas is going to release a mixture of enzymes referred to as pancreatic juices. So these two organs are going to release this right into the small intestine through the pancreatic duct and through the bile duct that connects the liver and the small intestine. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Quite a bit is going to happen. First, we have pancreatic amylase that is going to break down starch. Any starch that's left over is going to be further broken down to maltose. Okay, fats with the help of bile, and this enzyme called lipase will be broken down to glycerol plus 3 fatty acids. Now remember, these are the building blocks. We want this. We need this glycerol and the 3 fatty acids. Okay, proteins will be broken down partially by an enzyme called trypsin. They won't be fully broken down. They'll be partially broken down from a large protein to a polypeptide chain. Okay, and then we have a secondary enzyme called peptidase, which will take polypeptides and proteins and fully break them down into amino acids, which are part of our building blocks as well. All right, now we have, earlier we mentioned that, or I mentioned that starch was broken down to maltose, which is a disaccharide, remember? Now, that's not going to cut it because what the body actually needs is glucose. Well, of course, we have an enzyme for that. So all of the maltose that was accumulated in the mouth, for example, this all moves this way, and in the small intestine is essentially going to be broken down into every maltose will be divided or broken down into 2 glucose. So now we have our building blocks, things that are essential for life: glucose, amino acids, glycerol, and fatty acid tails. Okay, now this is digestion. All of this breaking down these larger macromolecules into the building blocks. That is digestion. Now, what about absorption? Okay, now absorption is going to occur in the small intestine as well, and eventually all of these will get sent to the hepatic portal system, which we will discuss or have discussed in in the other segment of lecture. Okay, now these building blocks will be absorbed and basically sent to our liver for cleansing, and then they are strategically, after cleansed and detoxed completely, then they are strategically placed and returned or put into our blood. Okay, and that is how we get our nutrients. Okay, then the next organ in the pathway is the large intestine. The large intestine will release water. It can release vitamins and salts as needed. And then from that point, everything that's left over, so we've taken all the good stuff. Okay, in this section, what's left over is waste. And the waste will move to the colon, to the rectum, to the anus, and out. Okay, now this entire pathway is a great thing to study, and then study it in this format for simplification, and you should be in good shape. Of course, you want to study the entire chapter, but this is a great pathway for you guys to study, and I would like for you to write it down and write every single detail down. So again, you can freeze the video at any time and rewatch it, or stop it so you can make sure that you get all of your notes. Okay, good luck.
The functions of the digestive system include ingestion of food, breakdown of food, absorption of nutrients, and elimination of indigestible remains. Digestion begins in the mouth, where the teeth break food into smaller particles during chewing. Salivary glands secrete saliva into the mouth, which begins chemical digestion and keeps the food moist. As food is swallowed, the soft palate blocks the upper pharynx to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and multiple voluntary muscles in the face, neck, and tongue contract, pushing food particles through the pharynx. The food passes over the epiglottis, which prevents food entry into the respiratory system, and then into the esophagus, which connects the pharynx to the stomach. The one-way movement of the food mass, called a bolus, is controlled by wave-like involuntary muscle contractions. The movement is known as peristalsis. The bolus enters the stomach, where folds in the stomach wall allow for expansion as it fills. Stomach cells secrete hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, and various regulatory hormones that aid in digesting the food. Muscles in the stomach wall contract to churn its contents. This breaks apart the bolus and mixes it with stomach secretions to form a thick liquid called chyme. Chyme exits the stomach through a sphincter muscle and enters the small intestine, which is the major site of nutrient absorption. Bile from the liver and digestive enzymes from the pancreas empty into the small intestine to aid in digestion. Absorbed nutrients pass from the lumen of the small intestine into blood and lymph. Chyme not absorbed in the small intestine enters the large intestine. As it passes through the cecum and colon, water, salts, and some vitamins are absorbed, and chyme is converted into feces. The large intestine stores feces until they are eliminated through the anus.